After a week of diving in the frigid winter waters of the Pacific Coast, we at Blue Water Photo and the Underwater Photography Guide have had the opportunity to put the Canon EOS R6 full-frame mirrorless camera to the test. As a more affordable sibling to the R5, the R6 is equipped with many of the same great features like 8 stops of 5-axis in-body image stabilization and animal eye autofocus tracking. But for a more affordable price point, it does compromise slightly when it comes to resolution and video features. Overall, we think the R6 is the best value underwater photo and video camera on the market, and here's why. Hey guys, this is Nirupam with the Underwater Photography Guide and Blue Water Photo. I'm here today with the Canon EOS R6 full-frame mirrorless camera. It is the little sibling to the R5, which has been one of the most popular mirrorless cameras on the market to date. The R6 is basically the same camera when it comes to settings, controls, and body shape. The only difference is really the resolution and the video capability. So the R6 compared to the R5 can take 20.1 megapixels versus I believe the R5 is 47 megapixels, and it can do 4K video up to 60 frames a second without RAW recording, so only C-Log recording, whereas the R5 can do 8K video with RAW recording as well as C-Log. But other than that, it is fairly similar. The autofocus system is basically the same, and it's been a really excellent camera to use. I've had the opportunity to take it diving and take it underwater for the last week or so, and it's been a very fun camera, and it is now my favorite prosumer camera on the market. So that's entry-level full-frame camera. So I just quickly wanted to go over some specifications. The R6 can shoot 20.1 megapixel photos, as I said, which is on the low end of resolutions for most cameras when it comes to the full-frame market, but because it is lower resolution, the pixels are larger on the sensor, which means that low light performance is actually slightly better than the R5 and other higher resolution full-frame cameras on the market. So the ISO can be pushed all the way up to extended, I think it's 204,800, but I don't recommend shooting at that ISO. However, we did find that we were able to shoot, up to 12,800 and still got good quality video. So that's very useful if you're taking low light video. I think the low light capability of the R6 is excellent. So if you are in cold water and you do a lot of night diving, I might recommend the R6 over the R5 if you're using it for video. Same if you're shooting photos and stills in cold water. The R6 is going to be better if you are going to push the ISO a little bit higher in those dark environments. It'll have less noise in the images. The in-body image stabilization system on the R6 is the same as the R5. It can recover up to 8 stops of exposure, which is really excellent. That means I was shooting at shutter speeds as low as I think 1/8 of a second handheld, getting crisp photos underwater I was actually really impressed with how low you can go with the shutter speeds here, and that really makes it so that, you know, if you're in a really dark environment but you still want those blue or green backgrounds in your photography, you can push down your shutter speed and you'll be able to still get crisp shots but get that color in the photograph. So far, I think the in-body image stabilization system on the R6 is better than the in-body image stabilization system on the Sony cameras, so like the Sony A7R4, Sony A7S III, and I do think it's better than the Nikons as well. So it's really the best camera on the market if you need that stabilization, and to me that's probably my favorite feature of shooting the R6 is that in-body image stabilization. Now when it comes to autofocus, I think the R6 is about the same as the R5 when it comes to autofocus system. It's very good. It's about as good as Sony's autofocus system. I was shooting with some EF lenses on here, not RF lenses. So with the EF glass, which is really what's available for underwater photography right now, I do think it's a little bit slower than Sony's, but we'll see how that goes with the RF glass. It could be just about the same. Now, what I really like about the autofocus system on the R5 and R6 is that the animal eye autofocus tracking works very well. So we were able to lock onto animals and lock onto their eyes with this camera automatically and follow their eyes around about 20 to 50, maybe 60% of the time. It's much more effective with a macro lens like I have on here, a 100mm macro, and it's a little bit less effective with wide angle photography just because the fish are a bit smaller in the frame, so the camera has a harder time finding those eyes. Whereas if you're shooting macro, you're shooting up close, it's gonna have an easier time finding those eyes. I find that it works really well with sculpins, lingcods, and fish that have big kind of bulgy eyes, it'll lock on very easily. When it comes to burst shooting, the R6 is pretty amazing. I mean, you might expect that from a lower resolution camera, but it can do 12 frames per second with the mechanical shutter and 20 frames per second with the silent shutter. Of course, when you're underwater, you're going to be using the mechanical shutter, but most strobes will not be able to keep up with 12 frames per second unless you're shooting at low strobe powers like you can with the YSD3. So the R6 is equipped with dual card slots for UHS-2 card slots. I do wish it had CF Express card slots like the EOS R5, but that's okay. The UHS-2 can still be pretty fast. Our card gets 300 megabytes per second. I do recommend having some large cards in there as well if you're going to shoot a lot of video. 4K video at 60 frames a second does take up a lot of space. Now, when it comes to video specs, as I mentioned before, this video does 4K video at 60 frames per second. It can capture 10-bit 422 internally, which means you have a really wide color gamut that can help when you are shooting log profiles. And when you go back into your post-processing and color grading your video, you can get a really nice color spectrum, and I highly recommend using it in certain scenes underwater, especially if you're trying to capture scenes with a lot of dynamic range and a lot of contrast. Now, I found the EVF, which is the electronic viewfinder, is actually very capable with this camera. It's 3.69 million dots, and when I was looking through it, it really felt almost like I was looking at a normal scene. I tested it out on the beach with a lot of reflection from the light. The dynamic range is really excellent. I really didn't feel like I was shooting an electronic viewfinder, which is really the goal when it comes to these. So you can shoot like you would with a normal viewfinder, but you can also play back your images in the viewfinder and see all your settings, and you never have to take your eye off. So if you do want to shoot with a magnified viewfinder underwater, you can spend the whole dive with your eye in the viewfinder. You can see everything you're doing, all your settings you're changing, all the images you take without ever taking your eye off. And I have done that during a dive. You can kind of lose yourself and end up with your eye on the viewfinder the whole time. So the battery life on the R6 is pretty good. I find that it's good for about 3 dives. Maybe you could push it to 4, especially if you're not shooting a lot of video. You could probably do 3 dives with 1 battery. It could be better, but it's not horrible. So I've been happy with the battery life. I usually change the batteries after 2 dives just to be certain that I always have enough battery. All right, let's talk a little bit about the ergonomics in the body of the R6. I find that it's one of the most ergonomic cameras that I've shot underwater. I think overall the button placement is really good. A lot of companies are going towards the same layout these days. There's a Q menu on here, so there's this Q button which will pull up. Let me see if I can, here we go, turn it on. So when you press the Q menu on your camera, it'll pull up all the main settings that you're gonna change underwater. So if you're in a photo mode, you'll have you know, your autofocus settings, your white balance, your metering, really anything that you might want to change, and that's pretty useful. The dials, it has basically 3 dials, so you have one dial on the back, one dial on the top, and then another dial where the D-pad used to be. Now, I personally like having a D-pad, but having a dial there is good too, because then you can set one for ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. So when it comes to autofocus points, the points are selected with the joystick. There's an autofocus toggle joystick. Unfortunately, not all housings can have compatibility for that joystick, but that's not really a huge deal because you can set your camera so that you press one button and you can dial your autofocus point with the dials and move it around the screen, and I actually find that tends to be a little bit quicker once you get the feel of it and the ergonomics of it become second nature. So as you probably know, the R5 had some problems with overheating. We have done some R5 overheating tests, and it's on our YouTube page and also on our website at Blue Water Photo Store. So if you're curious about how long it takes for the R5 to overheat, go check those out. When it comes to the R6, it's going to be a lot less likely to overheat during your dive, and that is because it can only shoot 4K at 60 frames per second. Now again, that's plenty of frames for stabilization and for slowing down your video and post-processing. However, because it doesn't have to process 120 frames per second at 4K or 8K video, it overheats after about 45 minutes. For most divers, that's going to be plenty of time. Shooting 45 minutes of video straight is likely just going to fill up your memory cards more than anything else. Most people don't do that, but if you do shoot a lot of video, after about 45 minutes, it can overheat. So let's talk a little bit about underwater image quality. Overall, I've been mostly, fairly impressed with the image quality on this camera, but it could be a little bit better for me. I do feel like the resolution at 20 megapixels is a little bit on the lower side, but it's still fine. It's still a lot more than, shooting photos with the A7S III, and I do think it still should be considered a top full-frame camera. Now, the reason that I wish there was a little bit more resolution is mostly for cropping with macro photos. Other than that, I really don't find that you need more resolution than 20 to 25 megapixels unless you're doing some really large prints. So if you're considering printing really large, I might recommend the R5, but I think the benefit of having less noise in my photos in low light is great. I did notice that there is less noise than with the R5 and the R6, but only slightly. I do think the difference is not enough to warrant buying the R6 just for the low light capability. Now, if you do shoot video, that difference might be worth it because you're going to be pushing the ISO a lot higher. But if you're shooting photos, the R5 should still be pretty good for low light, and the R6 is better. All right, let's talk a little bit about lens options. I know I already skimmed through them a little bit, but overall, right now, there's not much RF glass that I would recommend, except on the wide angle end of things. So right now, the Canon RF 15 to 35 millimeter is a great wide angle option if you're gonna shoot a rectilinear wide angle lens. That would be good for sharks, pelagic animals, animals where you don't really have a reef scene because the corners will be a little bit more distorted than with a fisheye, and a little bit softer. That being said, RF glass tends to have sharper corners, especially on land, so it might be worth looking into getting the RF 15 to 35 over a fisheye EF lens. Now, when you do look at EF lens options, there's 2 adapters. So you have an EF to EOS R adapter without a control ring, and then you have one with a control ring where you can turn that ring and you can set the control to control whatever you want, ISO, aperture, shutter speed, and it will do that. Now that will require having some kind of control ring here on your housing system, which can add a little bit of complexity, and you will need to turn it on the side. So overall, my favorite lens for macro is the Canon 100mm macro EF. and it's just a really nice lens. It has built-in optical image stabilization. It has a really good working distance, and it does 1:1 macro. Overall, the detail is excellent, and then when you combine that with a diopter that you can screw onto the front port of your housing, like the Blue Water Plus 7, the Nauticam SMC, it really adds a lot of detail to your images. When it comes to my favorite EF wide-angle lens, I really like shooting the Canon 8 to 15 millimeter fisheye. It's a circular fisheye lens that can go from a circular field of view, and then you can zoom in and it'll go to a normal fisheye field of view, which allows you with both lenses to get very close to your subject so that you can get a lot of color in your images with your strobes. So let's talk a little bit about underwater housings. There are 2 housings available for the Canon EOS R5 and EOS R6. Because the R6 is just a couple millimeters different from the R5, it does need a different housing. So right now there is an Lowlight housing, which is what I have here and what I shot during the past week. The Lowlight housing is a polycarbonate housing. It has a dry lock port system, a built-in vacuum where you do need to get the pump separately, and very nice ergonomics, and it's overall one of the lighter housings on the market. And then there is also a Nauticam housing, which makes high-grade professional quality aluminum housings. We do anticipate in the future for there to be 3 more aluminum housings for the R6, so that includes a housing from CNC, Aquatica, and Isoda. It just might take a little bit more time, and be sure to follow up with us at sales@bluewaterphotostore.com if you had any interest in these other 3 housings or interest in this housing or the Nauticam. Personally, I took this housing in some of the craziest conditions I've dived in the last 5 years. It's been a long time since I've done the crawl of shame in some surf. It was very heavy surf conditions, and I wasn't expecting it coming back in, and I ended up having to drag this housing over rocks, and I was very impressed that it did not get scratched up. So overall, I'm fairly pleased with the Lowlight, and I'm looking forward to shooting the Nauticam. I personally think that the Canon EOS R6 is an excellent camera for anybody who just wants to get into full-frame photography, especially full-frame underwater photography. It's a great starting point for a great price, and also it's good for professional users who do want something very affordable. The image quality is still very professional despite being a lower resolution than the R5. Same with the video quality. If you don't need video, like 8K video for cropping when you're taking macro video, overall I think the video on this is excellent. 4K at 60 frames a second is great, and most people don't need raw video. The Canon log video is fine. I think it color grades really well, as you can see in the sample video footage. So overall, if you're a new full-frame shooter, if you're thinking about getting an APS-C level camera, so that's something like the Sony a6000 series, I would seriously consider spending the extra $1,000 for an R6, but not having to spend an extra $2,000 for an R5. I think it's worth all the value you're getting out of it. The in-body image stabilization system and the autofocus system are worth that extra $1,000 in my opinion, if you are an underwater creative. Now, if you do need more resolution, you don't mind having a lot of large file sizes and large files, and you do want to make large prints, work on professional cinema level videography, then I would recommend the R5 over the R6, and even a cinema camera if you're really into videography, or the A7S III. But overall, I think most underwater photographers would be surprised how well the R6 fits their needs. 20 megapixels of resolution, it's not as much as you might hope from a full frame camera, but it's more than most people need. It's certainly more than enough for social media, Instagram, Facebook, and it's great for printing as well, as long as you're not going to print something the size of a wall, in which case I might recommend the Sony a7R4. So overall, the Canon EOS R6 far exceeded my expectations as an underwater camera. I was very happy with the image quality and the images that I got. I was happy with the low light capabilities when it came to underwater video. Yes, the Sony a7S III is one step ahead when it comes to video. The Canon EOS R5 is one step ahead when it comes to photos. But if you need the best of all worlds for a great price of $2,500 for the body, then I highly recommend the R6. And if you disagree with me, let me know. If you don't, if you think there's a better camera out there for that price, or if you have any opinions about the photos and video that I took, feel free to drop a comment below, and I'd be happy to answer any questions or anything that you might have. Anyway, thanks so much guys for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe, and you'll get more of our awesome content. We come out, we try to come out every few weeks with a new camera review. We keep up to date with all the cameras, and we make sure to dive with everything that comes out on the market.